The evening rush had just begun at Joe's family diner, where Priya wiped down another table, her feet aching from the 12-hour shift. The small bell above the door chimed endlessly as customers filed in, seeking warmth from the bitter Minneapolis winter. She'd been working double shifts for 3 months straight now, trying to keep up with her mother's mounting medical bills. "Order up," called Rick from the kitchen, his voice barely audible over the clinking of plates and murmur of conversation. Priya rushed to grab 2 steaming plates of meatloaf, plastering on her signature smile despite the exhaustion seeping into her bones. The diner wasn't fancy, just your typical small-town establishment with checkered floors and vinyl booths that had seen better days. But to Priya, it was a lifeline. Between serving tables, she'd sneak glances at her phone, checking messages from the home care nurse who looked after her mother. The latest update showed her mom had managed to eat a full meal today, small victories that kept Priya going. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her mind drifting to the stack of unpaid bills waiting at home. The regulars knew her story. How she'd put her nursing school dreams on hold when her mother's multiple sclerosis took a turn for the worse. They'd leave extra tips when they could, but times were tough for everyone in their small community. Still, Priya never complained. She'd inherited her mother's stubborn optimism, believing that hard work and kindness would somehow see them through. "Hey, sweetie, could I get a refill?" called Mrs. Henderson from booth 6, waving her empty coffee cup. Priya nodded, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts. As she made her rounds with the coffee pot, she overheard snippets of conversation. Birthday celebrations, work troubles, everyday moments that reminded her she wasn't alone in this daily struggle. The wall clock struck 7, and Priya knew the real dinner rush was about to begin. She quickly counted her tips from the afternoon, $43 and some change. Not great, but enough to pick up her mother's prescription tomorrow. She tucked the money into her apron pocket, straightened her name tag, and took a deep breath. The night was still young, and anything could happen. Little did she know, the next few hours would change her life forever. But for now, she focused on the simple things. The dinner rush was in full swing when the door chimed again. Priya looked up to see a family of 4 huddled together, a mother, father, and 2 small children. Their clothes were visibly worn, with patches carefully sewn onto the kids' jackets. The younger child, probably around 5, clutched a worn teddy bear missing one eye. They chose the corner booth, the one with the wobbly leg that most customers avoided. Priya watched as the parents whispered to each other, heads bent over the menu. The mother pulled out a small coin purse, and together they began counting change on the table, trying to be discreet, but clearly struggling with the prices. The older child, a girl with 2 neat braids, kept glancing at the pictures of desserts on the wall. Her little brother's stomach growled loudly, making him giggle and their mother shush him gently. "Maybe we should try somewhere else," Priya overheard the father whisper, his voice heavy with defeat. When Priya approached their table, she noticed how the parents tensed up. She'd seen that look before, the mix of pride and worry that came with hard times. "Our specials today are really good," she said warmly, pointing to the cheaper items on the menu. "The soup comes with free refills, and our kids' meals include a juice box." The mother's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of free refills. They ordered the minimum, 1 bowl of soup, to share between the parents and 2 small kids' meals. The children sat up straighter, trying to behave extra well, as if proving they deserved this rare treat. While waiting for their order, the younger child dropped his teddy bear. When Priya picked it up, she noticed his shoes. They were at least 2 sizes too big, probably handed down or from a donation center. The father caught her looking and quickly explained, "We're just going through a rough patch. Lost everything in a fire last week." His wife touched his arm, silently asking him not to say more. But Priya saw the hotel keycard peeking out of his pocket, the kind from those budget places that rent by the week. The children colored quietly with the crayons Priya had brought, sharing one kid's menu between them, careful not to press too hard so they wouldn't break. Behind the counter, Priya watched Rick prepare their simple order. She thought about her own struggles, about the times her mother had gone hungry to make sure Priya had enough to eat. Sometimes life's greatest moments of change come when you recognize your own story in someone else's eyes. And in that moment, standing there with her order pad in hand, Priya made a decision that would set in motion events she never could have imagined. Standing by the kitchen counter, Priya reached into her apron pocket and felt the day's tips, those precious dollars she'd been counting on for her mother's prescription. Her fingers traced the edges of the worn bills as she watched the family trying to make their small portions last. The little boy was taking tiny spoonfuls of his mac and cheese, making each bite count, while his sister carefully cut her grilled cheese into 8 perfect pieces. The parents were sharing their soup, each taking small sips and leaving most of it for their children when they inevitably would still be hungry. It was a dance Priya knew all too well from her own childhood. Parents pretending they weren't hungry so their kids could eat more. Rick, the cook, came up beside her. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her lost in thought. Priya nodded, then reached for her wallet in her locker behind the counter. She pulled out the emergency 20 she kept tucked away, the one she'd promised herself she wouldn't touch unless absolutely necessary. "I need to do something," she told Rick, her voice quiet but determined. She looked at her tip money again, $43 and some change. The family's bill would come to about $32 with tax. Her mother's prescription was $50. For a moment, doubt crept in. The practical voice in her head reminded her about the overdue electric bill, the empty kitchen cabinets at home, her mother's medicine. But then she remembered something her mother always said. When you have a chance to be someone's miracle, take it. Priya watched as the little girl carefully wrapped half her grilled cheese in a napkin, probably saving it for later. That was the moment her decision became crystal clear. Some things were worth more than money. She pulled out her tips and the 20, quickly walking to the register before she could change her mind. "I'm paying for table 12, she told Nancy, the cashier, sliding over the money. Nancy raised an eyebrow. She knew about Priya's situation. "Are you sure about this, honey? That's your whole day's tips." Priya just nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She'd grown up watching her own mother perform small miracles, stretching dollars until they screamed, but always finding a way to help others even when they barely had enough for themselves. Sometimes the best gifts come from those who can least afford to give them, her mother would say. Standing there now, Priya understood those words more than ever. She wasn't just paying for a meal. She was giving this family a moment of dignity, a brief respite from their worries, a chance to just be together without the weight of the world on their shoulders. What Priya didn't notice was the man in the business suit sitting in the far corner. He'd been quietly observing everything while working on his laptop, his coffee going cold beside him. He watched as Priya took the family's bill and replaced it with a note that simply read, "Tonight's dinner is taken care of. Better days are coming." His eyes followed her as she turned away quickly, pretending to be busy with other tables so the family wouldn't know who had helped them. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that turn into waves. And in that simple diner, on that ordinary evening, a wave was building, one that would change not just one life, but many. When Priya brought the note to the family's table, she tried to act normal, like this was just another bill delivery. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. The mother picked up the note, her hands shaking slightly as she read it. She read it again, then passed it to her husband, whose eyes quickly filled with tears. "There must be some mistake," the father said, his voice cracking. He waved Priya back to the table, holding up the note. "We can't accept this. We'll find a way to pay." But Priya had already turned to walk away when she heard the mother begin to cry, not the quiet tears of sadness, but deep sobs of relief that seemed to come from somewhere far inside. The little boy, confused by his mother's tears, wrapped his small arms around her neck. "Why are you crying, Mommy?" he asked loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. The mother pulled both children close, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. Sometimes people cry when they're happy, the older sister explained matter-of-factly, patting her mother's back. This made several nearby customers discreetly wipe their own eyes. The father stood up suddenly, looking around the diner, desperately trying to figure out who had paid their bill. That's when the story spilled out, not just to Priya, but to everyone within earshot. They'd lost everything in an apartment fire last week. No insurance. The father had just started a new job, but they wouldn't get paid for another 2 weeks. They'd been living in a budget motel, stretching their last few dollars, trying to keep the kids from understanding just how bad things were. "We haven't had a proper meal in days," the mother admitted, still clutching the note. "We've been telling the kids it's like camping, making adventures out of eating crackers and peanut butter." She looked down at their empty plates, the first real meal they'd had all week. The little boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Daddy, does this mean we're not poor anymore?" he asked innocently. The father knelt down to his son's level, his voice gentle but firm. "We're not poor, buddy. We're rich in love, and sometimes, like today, we're rich in kindness too." From her spot near the counter, Priya felt a warm glow in her chest that no amount of tip money could ever match. She watched as the family gathered their few belongings, the children carefully handling their leftover, wrapped sandwiches like treasure. The mother kept looking around, hoping to thank their anonymous benefactor, her eyes still bright with tears. Just before they left, the little girl ran back and placed her carefully colored picture from the kids' menu on the counter. It showed a bright sun shining over a house, with 4 stick figures standing in front. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, she'd written, "Thank you, Diner Angel." The man in the business suit was still watching, his laptop now closed. He'd seen everything. The family's reaction, their story, and most importantly, the waitress who'd given up her day's earnings without hesitation. As he pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, a plan was already forming in his mind. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest changes in life start with the smallest acts of kindness. The businessman in the corner, Mr. Chen, had barely touched his coffee. For the past hour, he'd been completely absorbed in watching the scene unfold before him. As a successful tech company owner, he was used to making million-dollar decisions, but something about this simple act of kindness had struck a deeper chord. He called over Nancy, the cashier, while Priya was busy with other tables. "Tell me about her," he said quietly, nodding toward Priya. Nancy's face softened. "That girl? She's one of the good ones. Works doubles most days to take care of her sick mother. Could have been a nurse by now if life had been a little kinder." Mr. Chen's mind wandered back to his own childhood. He remembered the nights his family had gone hungry, how his mother would make magic soup, really just hot water with a few vegetables when they couldn't afford more. He remembered the kind neighbor who'd sometimes bring them leftovers, pretending she'd made too much food. That neighbor never knew her simple acts of kindness had helped fuel his determination to succeed. He pulled out his phone again, making a few quick calls. "I need information about one of your employees," he told the diner's owner over the phone. The owner, knowing Mr. Chen as a regular customer and respected businessman, shared what he knew. How Priya had never missed a shift, even when her car broke down and she had to walk 3 miles in the snow. How she'd organize a small fundraiser for another waitress whose husband had cancer. How she'd been saving for nursing school before her mother got sick. Mr. Chen watched as Priya moved between tables, her smile genuine despite her obvious exhaustion. She stopped to help an elderly customer cut his meat, took time to chat with a lonely regular, and somehow managed to keep everyone's coffee cups full. All this after giving away her entire day's tips. He opened his laptop again, pulling up his bank account. The numbers on the screen were impressive. More money than he'd ever dreamed of having as a child. But watching Priya, he realized something important. True wealth wasn't just about having money. It was about knowing when and how to share it. As he typed a few more notes, he thought about how a single moment of kindness could change everything. He'd seen it in his own life. That neighbor's kindness had taught him the importance of helping others, a lesson that had shaped his business philosophy and led to his success. Through the window, he could see the family from earlier walking away, the children holding hands, their steps lighter now. The little girl was still clutching her wrapped half-sandwich like it was precious gold. It reminded him of how he used to save half his school lunch for his younger sister. Mr. Chen made one final call to his lawyer. "Remember that foundation we discussed? I think I found our first recipient." He looked at Priya again, who was now cleaning tables with the same care she'd shown her customers. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness had set wheels in motion, wheels that would soon change her life forever. Sometimes, he thought, angels didn't wear wings. They wore waitress aprons and gave away their last dollars to help strangers. And sometimes, those angels deserved to have someone looking out for them too. The next morning, Mr. Chen sat in his spacious office, surrounded by awards and certificates that told the story of his success. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the remarkable act of kindness he'd witnessed the night before. His assistant had spent hours gathering information about Priya, and each detail made him more certain about his decision. Through careful investigation, he learned that Priya lived in a small apartment near the bus route to the diner. Her mother's medical bills were stacked high. Multiple sclerosis treatment wasn't cheap, and their insurance barely covered the basics. She'd been making payments of $50 here, $100 there, whenever she could squeeze it from her wages. His team discovered her old nursing school application from 3 years ago. She'd been accepted with a partial scholarship, but had to withdraw when her mother's condition worsened. The acceptance letter was still pinned to her mother's bulletin board at home. A dream deferred, but not forgotten. The diner's owner had been especially helpful, sharing stories that painted a picture of someone special. Like the time Priya organized a Christmas gift collection for the janitor's kids, or how she kept a secret stash of granola bars for hungry kids who came in with their parents at the end of tough months. "She works harder than anyone I've ever met," the owner had said. "Never complains, even when she's dead on her feet. But lately, I can see the worry in her eyes. Her mother's medical bills are crushing her." Mr. Chen walked to his window, looking out over the city. He built his tech company from nothing, turning a small startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. But he'd never forgotten his roots, the poverty, the struggle, the kind neighbors who'd helped along the way. His phone buzzed with another update. His team had found the family from the diner. They were still at the budget motel, the father walking 2 miles each way to his new job at a warehouse. The mother had been a teacher before the fire, and the kids were missing school because they'd lost their backpacks and supplies in the flames. Mr. Chen smiled, making a mental note to help them too. But first, he needed to focus on Priya. He'd seen thousands of employees over the years, made countless business deals, but there was something different about this waitress who gave away her last dollars to help strangers. He pulled up a document on his computer, the paperwork for his new charitable foundation. He'd been planning it for months, wanting to help people in meaningful ways, but hadn't found the right way to start. Now, watching Priya's story unfold, he knew exactly what to do. His lawyer had already drawn up the papers. Everything was in order. Now he just needed the right moment. Glancing at his watch, he knew Priya would be starting her shift soon, probably still worried about making up the tips she'd given away, unaware that her simple act of kindness had touched someone who could change everything. Sometimes, he said to himself, remembering his mother's words from long ago, angels come disguised as ordinary people. Yesterday, he'd seen an angel in a waitress's apron. Today, he would make sure that Angel got her wings back. A week had passed since that unforgettable evening. The diner buzzed with its usual breakfast crowd as Priya tied her apron, still thinking about the family she'd helped. She'd managed to pick up extra shifts to make up for the lost tips, though her feet ached more than usual. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust particles in golden beams. The smell of coffee and fresh pancakes filled the air as Priya started her usual routine, checking sugar dispensers, wiping down menus, greeting the regulars who came in for their morning coffee. "Your usual morning crowd's here," Nancy called from the register, nodding toward booth 3 where an elderly couple always ordered the same breakfast: one scrambled egg with dry toast for him, oatmeal with fresh berries for her. The bell above the door chimed, and Priya looked up to see a familiar face, the businessman from last week. She remembered him sitting in the corner that evening, though she hadn't paid much attention then. He was dressed differently today, more casual in a simple sweater rather than his usual suit. He chose a small table by the window, pulling out his laptop like he had before. Priya approached with her coffee pot, trying to remember if he'd been a regular before that night. "Good morning, sir. Coffee?" He nodded, smiling warmly. There was something different about his expression, like he knew a wonderful secret. "Just coffee for now," he said, sliding an envelope across the table. "And this is for you." Priya looked at the plain white envelope with confusion. "I think there's been a mistake," she started, but he shook his head. "No mistake. I was here last week when you paid for that family's dinner." His voice was gentle but firm. "I saw everything." Priya felt her cheeks grow warm. She hadn't wanted anyone to know about that. "It was nothing," she mumbled, embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," he said quietly. "You did. And you did it when you could least afford to." The diner seemed to grow quieter, though perhaps it was just the blood rushing in her ears. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, and something told her this wasn't just a generous tip. "Open it," he encouraged, taking a sip of his coffee. "But you might want to sit down first." Priya glanced around. Her other tables were fine for the moment. Slowly, she slid into the chair across from him, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched the envelope seal. She could feel the businessman watching her, but his expression wasn't one of charity or pity. Instead, he looked like someone about to witness a miracle, which she would soon discover he was. The morning sun caught the edge of the envelope as she began to open it, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the murmur of conversations, even the usual morning rush, all of it faded into the background as Priya opened what would turn out to be not just an envelope, but a door to a whole new life. Priya's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a check, but when she saw the amount, her vision blurred. She blinked hard, certain she was seeing things wrong. $1 million. She read it again. And again. The numbers didn't change. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of coffee cups and morning chatter. Her legs felt weak, and she was grateful she'd taken his advice to sit down. The businessman leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Let me explain," he said softly. "I grew up poor. My mother worked 3 jobs, and there were many nights we went to bed hungry. But there were people, angels really, who helped us along the way. Last week, I saw you become someone's angel." Priya tried to hand the check back, but he gently pushed it toward her. "You gave your last dollars to help strangers," he continued. "You did it without hesitation, without recognition, and without expecting anything in return. That's exactly the kind of person this world needs more of." Tears welled up in Priya's eyes. She thought about her mother at home, probably worried about her next medical bill. She thought about her nursing school dreams, carefully folded away like old photographs. $1 million. It seemed impossible. "But why?" she managed to ask, her voice cracking. "There are so many people who need help." The businessman smiled. "You're right. And that's exactly why I'm giving this to you. Because I know you'll use it not just to help yourself, but to help others too. Consider it an investment in kindness." Nancy walked by, noticed Priya's tears, and shot a concerned look their way. Priya quickly wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. The morning rush was still happening around them, life going on as normal, while her whole world shifted on its axis. The check is just the beginning, the businessman explained. My foundation will help you set up a financial plan. We'll make sure your mother gets the best medical care available. And, he paused, pulling out another envelope, we've already arranged for your readmission to nursing school, with all expenses covered. The dam broke. Priya covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All around her, the diner continued its morning dance, coffee being poured, orders being called, plates clinking. But in this moment, she felt like she was in the eye of a storm, everything around her moving while she sat perfectly still. Your act of kindness showed me something important, the businessman continued gently. Sometimes the people who deserve help the most are the ones busy helping others. You paid for that family's dinner without knowing I was watching. You did it simply because it was the right thing to do. Through her tears, Priya saw Rick peeking out from the kitchen, concern written on his face. She gave him a watery smile and a small thumbs up. Her hands were still trembling as she carefully folded the check and tucked it into her apron pocket. I don't know how to thank you, she began, but the businessman shook his head. Don't thank me, he said, standing up. Just keep being who you are. Sometimes angels wear business suits instead of wings. He smiled, echoing her own kindness back to her. And sometimes they wear aprons. 3 years had passed since that life-changing morning in the diner. The old building still stood, but now a small plaque hung by the entrance, where kindness serves more than just coffee. Inside, the smell of fresh pancakes and coffee still filled the air, but much had changed. Priya, now a registered nurse, still visited every Sunday morning. She'd sit in her old section, ordering coffee from the new waitresses who knew her story like a legend. But today was special. She wasn't alone. Beside her sat the family she'd helped that fateful night. The children had grown taller, their clothes no longer worn and patched. The little boy's teddy bear had been properly repaired, sporting 2 matching eyes now. His sister, older and wiser, was showing off her recent school awards. Their parents looked different too. The weight of worry had lifted from their shoulders. The father had found stable work through one of Mr. Chen's companies, and the mother had returned to teaching. They'd moved into a comfortable home, rebuilding their lives piece by piece. But they weren't just there for breakfast. They were celebrating the grand opening of the Second Chance Foundation, Prida's new charity organization, housed in a renovated building right next door to the diner. The foundation specialized in helping families affected by house fires, providing temporary housing, clothes, school supplies, and most importantly, hope. Remember when you wrapped half your grilled cheese in a napkin? Priya asked the young girl, who blushed at the memory. Now we make sure no child in our community goes hungry. The foundation's walls were lined with photos. Families helped, homes rebuilt, dreams restored. But in the center hung a simple children's drawing in a golden frame, a bright sun shining over a house, with the words, "Thank you, Diner Angel," still visible after all these years. Mr. Chen joined them, having flown in specially for the opening. He'd become more than just a benefactor. He was family now. He watched with pride as Priya showed them around the foundation's facilities. The emergency housing units, the clothing bank, the education center where her mother, now receiving top-notch medical care, taught art classes from her wheelchair. You turned $1 million into 1,000,000 acts of kindness, he said softly, watching volunteers prepare care packages for newly displaced families. Priya smiled, remembering how it all began. The foundation didn't just help fire victims, it employed them too. The father from that night now managed their housing program. Other survivors worked as counselors, understanding exactly what new families were going through. Back in the diner, Nancy still worked the register, telling newcomers the story of the waitress who gave away her last dollars and received a miracle in return. But she always ended it the same way. The real miracle wasn't the money. It was what she did with it. As they all gathered for a photo outside the foundation, Priya looked around at the lives touched and changed. She thought about that tired waitress from 3 years ago, counting tips and worrying about bills. One small act of kindness had created ripples that turned into waves, waves that lifted not just her boat but countless others. The little boy tugged at her sleeve. "Are you still an angel?" he asked innocently. Priya knelt down to his level, just as his father had done that night in the diner. "We all are," she said, looking at the gathered crowd of helpers, survivors, and dreamers. "Sometimes angels wear business suits, sometimes they wear aprons, and sometimes," she touched his nose gently, making him giggle, "they look just like you and me."